am so pleased to see all of you here. I spent the last 2 days recording the audiobook for Stumbling Towards Inclusion. Has anyone ever recorded an audiobook? Me neither. I learned a lot recording an audiobook. One, you're not allowed to make a single mistake. Like, you have to read exactly word for word what is in the book. You're not allowed to go off script. It has to be perfect. So it already broke two of my most important fundamental rules as a human being, which is I love making mistakes and I go off script all the time. So I hope I have your permission to do both of those things today, yes? Okay, good. Because I plan on doing both a lot, and I want to invite you to do all of that as well today. The book is about imperfect leadership, and I'm the model, I hope, of imperfect leadership. The other thing I learned about recording an audiobook is I hadn't actually read my book cover to cover. I wrote it, but I didn't actually read it. And so when you're sitting there, you're reading it, you have this like sort of cognitive dissonance because you're reading about a character who is you, but it feels like it's not you. And my part of my brain is processing, who is this person? Like, this sounds really familiar, right? And the other part of my brain is thinking, gosh, there's so many stories that made it into the book, and then there's so many stories that are on the cutting room floor. And I thought about, well, one story that I didn't actually tell in the book is why I wrote this book. And so I thought there's a short version of that story and there's a long version of that story, and I'm going to tell you both those today. And they're not in the book, so this is your exclusive insider view of those two stories. The short story of why I wrote this book is, as Elizabeth mentioned, back in 2016, I started the Roundtable Institute the day after the U.S. presidential elections were decided. I immediately woke up that morning and I thought, oh gosh, the voices of women, the voices of minoritized people were going to be categorically dismissed. And I no longer wanted to take that sitting down. I wanted to stand up and do something about it. So I started the Roundtable Institute, and that's the beginning of Roundtable. And I started working with leaders, and I developed this program called JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for Leaders. And it started growing. And pretty soon, without even realizing it, companies were changing, and people's behaviors were changing. People were having better conversations with each other. They were giving each other feedback. They were being more courageous and vulnerable and authentic. And pretty soon my client said, you can't hoard this stuff, Priya. You got to write a book. So I said, okay, I'll write a book. And it took me like 10 years. But here we are. The book is here. That's the short story. I'm going to spend the next 4 hours telling you the long story. Just kidding. I'm going to spend the next about 15, 20 minutes telling you the longer version of the story. So if has anyone actually read my book? It's okay if you haven't. Thank you. Part one, when I was shopping around for publishers, it was really just part 2, 3, and 4, which is the mechanics of leadership, why we should think about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion as leaders, why we should care. And then I wanted to share some failures and success stories of my clients. But the publishers said, we really need to see the person behind this book. We need you to tell your story. And I was like, no, you could publish this book, but they didn't really want that. And so I had to really do some soul searching and start to excavate my own story and understand the roots of my story. And so if you've read part 1, you'll see that I had a really lovely childhood. I grew up in Ottawa, Canada, and my dad, who's here, worked full-time, and my mom, who's sitting right beside him, stayed at home until I went to high school, and then she started to work. And I had an amazing older sister who lives in Atlanta and couldn't be here today. But I really looked up to her. I admired her. She was and is beautiful and intelligent and smart, and she took me under her wing. And I come from a long line of feminists on my mom's side and a long line of performers on my dad's side, and both sides are very intentional scholars. So I'm a product of those two lineages. And We loved Celine Dion, and we loved Phil Collins as much as we loved Lata Mangeshkar and Bhimsen Joshi. So I had a really nice blend of Indian and Western values growing up. And I went to a French immersion school. I learned French with the other kids in my neighborhood, and everything was going great. But every year, something would happen that just wasn't so great. Like in kindergarten, when a little boy asked me to step out of the class picture because I was the only brown kid, and I would ruin it for all the white kids. Or in second grade, when I worked so hard and I practiced so much for the speech competition, and then I was rejected because I said one word in an Indian accent. Or in fourth grade, when during a routine lice inspection, me and the other brown kid were asked to go home because we had dirty hair. Or in fifth grade, when I desperately wanted to play the trumpet and the music teacher said, nope, your lips are too big. Do these sound familiar to anyone? Like these kinds of experiences? All throughout childhood, my parents didn't think that my name was so complicated, but my teachers reminded me all the time that it was, and they wouldn't even try to say it right, even after I would remind them how to say my name. And it's Priya Nalkur. But you know what? This kind of thing wasn't happening to my sister. It was happening to me, and it didn't seem to be happening to anyone else around me. I was mostly around white kids. So I started to think it was a me thing. And I thought, okay, I better just focus on the two things that are actually going well in my life. And the two things that were going well in my life were school and swim team. So yeah, I was a swimmer. I was on the swim team. And I didn't have many places in my life where I felt at home or where I really felt like I belonged. But the pool was one place where I really felt like I could belong. And I remember the feeling that I still get here at the JCC occasionally of walking out on that wet pool deck with those wet tiles under my feet and diving into the water and gliding through it and finally feeling free and happy. And unfortunately, my high school didn't have a swim team, so it meant I had to quit swimming. And as I quit swimming, my grades also started to drop. So the two things that I had were starting to slip away. I even had a grade 11 math teacher who told me, you should probably stop taking math, especially in college, because you're just never going to get good at it. Can you believe it? But I did have an English teacher who was fantastic, and she said, learn to write well. It could save your life. So eventually I did graduate high school just by a hair. And I managed to get my way into the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario. And there's another alumni here. And I remember entering the gates of that campus. It's a beautiful campus. And I remember entering the gates thinking, okay, this is where I'm going to learn who I am. And this is where I'm going to learn to write. And I was a kinesiology major. Does anyone know what kinesiology is? It's a fancy word for phys ed. At the time, nobody really knew what kinesiology was. So you can imagine how crestfallen I was when in my first class I sat down in a room of 1,200 other students, and the professor said, your entire grade will be determined by your performance on a multiple choice exam. And then the professor after her said the same thing, and the professor after him said the same thing, and the final professor said the same thing. So it meant I had to memorize facts, which I wasn't good at. It meant I had to read a lot and try to retain all the information, and I couldn't be in dialogue or debate or reflect or explore, which was, I learned 20 years later, my preferred way of learning. So I really struggled in those first 2 years. I just didn't do well. I didn't like my classes. I struggled. I barely passed. And so by the time I got to my third year, I said, okay, something's got to change here. Either I got to change my major or I've got to change the way I'm learning. And I remember making an appointment with my academic advisor. And it was a cold, windy, rainy morning in London, Ontario. And I had to walk up. If you've ever been to this campus, it was a huge hill. And yeah, so like the dorms are at the bottom of the hill. And as though you're being punished for going to classes, you've got to walk up this enormous hill. And so I made an appointment with her, and I started walking up that hill, and it's cold and windy and rainy, and you can imagine I'm carrying, like, of course, a 100-pound backpack with all my books in it. And so by the time I get to her office, I'm, like, red and sweaty and sniffly. And I walk in, and she has this big orange linty chair, and I sit down, and I'm sniffling, and she hands me a tissue box like this. And I immediately was like, oh, she doesn't want me here. She doesn't want to help me. So I stood up and I said, listen, I'm done with multiple choice. I need to learn to write. And in the same manner, she said, well, why don't you just go across campus and take courses in Indian history? I had a similar reaction as you're having right now. I thought, you got to be kidding me. Is this another microaggression? Are you trying to tell me that I don't belong in kinesiology, or are you telling me that I'd only do well in courses that look like me? But I was a very obedient young adult. That changed eventually. But at the time I was obedient, and I thought, well, I didn't even know that Western had courses in Indian history, so let me explore it. So I went to my dorm and I started exploring it. And I started to get excited because these were writing-intensive courses. And I thought, I don't need to memorize facts anymore. And before I knew it, I had signed up for the philosophy of Gandhi, advanced Hindu mythology, and religions of the Indian subcontinent. And these were the courses of a kinesiology major. But I was finally excited about my studies again. And I started to brag to my friends about the courses I got to take and what I was going to learn about. And my excitement and my enthusiasm for learning was coming back. And I remember sitting in that first class of the philosophy of Gandhi. I sat in the front row, just like my two kids are doing right now. And the professor walked in and came to the front, and she put her glasses and her pen on the podium. And she said, my name is Dr. Aruna Mathur. In this class, you will read Gandhi's biography, and you will seek your own truth, and you will show me who you are. And then she said the thing that blew us all away. You can imagine a room of 100 undergraduates. She said, your final grade will be determined by one project, and you get to decide what to do for that final project. So imagine the confusion, right? She just gave 100 undergraduates permission to do whatever they wanted. And one kid, everyone raised their hand, and one kid at the back of the room went, anything? And Aruna went, yes, anything. Write about how you would like to change the world. Write a poem and perform it. Write a play. Get people to act it out. Create a machine. Do what you want. Show me who you are and show me what's possible. So Aruna's class was a philosophy class about peace and humanity. And she used Gandhi as an example to teach us about the concepts of ahimsa and satyagraha, which are the concepts of nonviolence and passive political resistance. And she told us about leaders like Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and Rosa Parks, people who changed the world through their own example. And she also taught us that there's no easy answer to sustainable peace, that people are going to be mean, there's going to be hate, and that peace only exists because conflict exists. And I found that at once frustrating, but also extremely liberating, that people could do something about it and that it is going to persist and sustain itself. So I was really inspired because she taught us how to be in debate with each other. She taught us how to dialogue with each other. And so I made it a point to study and to learn and to really explore. So it became a habit of mine to, wolf down my meal at my dorm and then walk across campus to the big library, where I would park myself at the very back of the main floor on a table. And pretty soon I became one of those library regulars. In college, they have those kids who are like always there, always in the same place. I was one of those kids. And I got to know some of the other kids in the library, and I would start to explore. I would just put my bag down and start to explore books. And this is where I started to really start to learn to read, or love to read, I should say. I knew how to read before that. And there was this one kid who was also a library regular, and he was about 3 tables down from me. And in our awkward undergraduate way, we would glance at each other every night, but never actually say anything to each other. And then one night, I was carrying this big, huge stack of books back to my table. And I saw him get up from his chair and cross the row of tables towards me. And he said, "Let me give you a hand." Sure. And he said, "You're like always here." And I said, "So are you." And he's like, "Well, why are you studying so hard? Are you like trying to get into medical school or something?" And I said, "No, I just really love this course and I want to do well." He's like, "Did you know that working hard is a response to trauma?" And I thought, are you trying to psychoanalyze me? You just met me. You're weird. He said, "You're weird." And like that, we became friends. And he started sitting at my table. And I learned that Hussein was a medical student himself. And Hussein would teach me about all the things he was learning in organic chemistry and biology. And he would, debate with me over things I was learning in conflict resolution and leadership. And I found him so infuriating because no matter what I shared with him, he would play devil's advocate. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? And I would have to defend and answer and explore and think. And then I would start doing the same thing to him. Well, what about this? And what about that? How are you ever going to use that? You're going to save people's lives with some organic chemistry equation? But then a funny thing happened when I went back home, I would realize I wanted to be in debate like that because he never made me wrong. He just made me think. And because he was so different, we never really saw eye to eye on things. And I was the whole reason I continued to go back to the library every night was to be in conversation with him and never see eye to eye with him. He also learned by writing. So he would write out these long equations and these long definitions and proudly show them to me. And, I would have all these books in front of me and I would put Post-it notes over them with ideas and questions and words that I wanted to look up. And I would copy full paragraphs out of books that I was reading and I would show them to him and he would say, "Hey, that's kind of interesting. Maybe you should write something about that." So I started to write and I started to construct these essays with some ideas and arguments, and I would start to show professors, and they were very encouraging even as they gave me constructive feedback. And I started to feel good about my writing, and I would take it to the writing center, and the writing TAs would say things like, "You're so poetic. You have such command of the English language," whatever that's supposed to mean. But when it came time to writing for Aruna's class, it was weird. It was like I would be staring at this blank screen with either too much to say or not enough to say. And I would get confused and I would get writer's block and I would come up with these like cheesy, lofty things like, "My heart is ablaze with a fervent desire to forge a path for world peace." And then I would like rip it out and throw it out because it was just too much. And it didn't make any sense to me because I was going to the library, I was doing what I was supposed to do, I was following the rules, and I still wasn't able to produce. So one night, I was invited to the president's home This was Paul Davenport back in 1997 or something like that. He invited the resident advisors to his home. And I was a resident advisor at the time, so I got to go. And when I was there, I ran into Dr. Aruna. And she looked so sophisticated in this nice long dress, carrying a glass of champagne. And she approached me and she said, "Stop trying so hard to please me. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be meaningful." And I left that night thinking, what does that mean? Because all I've tried to do in my life was be perfect. And whenever I wasn't perfect, people didn't like me. So what does this mean? I don't have to be perfect. I have to be meaningful. And I thought about it and I obsessed over it. And I still think about it to this day because I don't think I know it's emerging and it's evolving, but those words really stuck with me. So the next night I went back to the library and I saw Hussein, and the deadline for this paper is looming and I still have nothing. So I said to him, "You know what, I think I'm going to take a break from the library for a few days. Maybe a change of scenery will help." And I went back to my dorm and started writing, and the very next day, a few thousand miles from where I was living, 2 armed students walked into Columbine High School and started shooting. And by the time they were done, 15 people, including the 2 of them, were killed. And over the next few days, I knew exactly who I was. I was a brown girl who grew up among a sea of white people who had to face racism way earlier than anyone could have prepared her for. I was someone who could not accept hatred, ignorance, and discrimination sitting down. I was someone who could see the beauty in different perspectives and someone who invited difference. And I understood that this is what I had to write to Aruna about. So that night, I penned a letter. "Dear Aruna." And I started to write. I told her that I thought Gandhi was a complicated man. And yes, he was a freedom fighter for India, but he was a deeply flawed man, and perhaps we should stop valorizing him. Because each of us has it within us to also lead. And that if we practiced nonviolence and kindness, perhaps those 15 people's lives would have had a different ending. So I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. At 11:55, before the deadline of midnight, I hit submit. And then I waited 1 whole agonizing week. And it was the last day of class, and Aruna was handing back the papers, and I eagerly awaited for her grade. And she came to me and she gave me my paper. And this woman had no facial expression when she gave it back to me. And I eagerly looked through all the pages, and it doesn't even look like she's read it. And on the last page, in green ink, there's my score, 30 out of 30. A perfect score, but with no meaning. And I thought, what a lady. And then she approached me at the end of class, and she said, "I never give out perfect scores. Now go take this and make a life out of it." Thank you. So that's the story that didn't make it into the book. And I wanted to share it with you because for me, it's really meaningful. It's not a perfect story. In fact, I practiced it on my kids, and they're gonna already see that, no, Mom, you didn't do it the same way. But it's deeply meaningful to me, and I have some takeaways that I'd like to share with you. But before I do that, I thought I would ask you, because I've been doing all the talking, if you have any takeaways from this story. Was there anything that resonated with you? Was there anything that, I have tissues for those of you crying? Sorry, I do that. I make people cry. Yeah. It's allergies, I know. Any takeaways? Who'd like to share takeaways? Questions, insights from that story? Go ahead, Myra.
I realized that we can't figure out ourselves on our own. Sometimes we need people to prod us and nudge us and turn us into that direction to get to know ourselves better.
Yes, thank you. We can't figure ourselves out on our own. We need to rely on others to help us, to probe us, to ask us questions, to help us reflect more deeply. And I certainly have lots of people in this room who have done that for me. Other insights? Karen.
I think it's interesting because part of the story was there can't be peace without war, or there's conflict, right? And it's like there can't be, the road to perfection is through your imperfections, but it's very difficult, not really for me, I'm used to being imperfect, I'm like very comfortable there. But to try to get to that area of perfection, I think a lot of people believe that you get there by being perfect. Like, you're perfect, you get all A's, great. You go to the next one, you get all A's, oh great. And then one day you're freaking failing kinesiology. I did not know that, and I've known you for 10 years. So like, right? I mean, because you're just trying to be so perfect, and then you're like, what is this, like where did all of that get me? And it's about the imperfections and the culmination of them leading to making you whatever your perfect self is, which is weirdly like adverse, right? It's like completely opposite, and not intuitive at all.
Yes, thank you. So one inspiration for this book is a quote by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who says, "Nature loves small errors." The idea of that quote is that we have to make mistakes in order to get closer to our end goal. But those mistakes keep getting smaller and smaller, but they never actually go away. But we love small errors because they tell us we're on the right path, which is not perfection. Thank you. Other takeaways? Yes, Namrata.
So I really love the idea of, the idea of critical thinking and what that actually does for you in terms of your learning and growing, because I similarly I was born and brought up in India, and my school system really drilled it into me that memorization and like rote learning was the only way to learn. And so when I moved to the States at age 12, I did not understand the concept of critical thinking. Like, I didn't know what a research paper was, I didn't know how to take notes. And so I think this idea of critical thinking, asking questions, playing devil's advocate is so, so valuable, especially for kids as they're learning. And even for us as adults, as we start to get really set in our ways, I think we have to keep reminding ourselves to, question and challenge all the time. So yeah, I love it.
Thank you. It's true. We have clients who want the simple answer to inclusive leadership. And I'm not the right vendor for them because there is no simple answer. They want the playbook. There is no playbook. They want the definitions. The definitions change. You'll see in part 3 of my book. The definitions are changing daily. What you could say yesterday, you can no longer say today. So it has to be a reflective, emergent process. We have to learn that way. We can learn rote too, but we have to really engage in the process of exploration. So my amazing admin, Shannon, put these quotes up, which I'm going to skip ahead of. So that I can share my takeaways. I hope that by sharing my story, it built a connection. Because it's one way to know ourselves, but it's also another way to be known by others. And as humans, ultimately, that's what we're seeking, is to be known, to be understood, to be accepted by others. And the way to do that, I have found, is through storytelling, and that's easier said than done. Telling stories is a hard thing to do, but I want to encourage you to start telling yours or writing yours or thinking of what yours is. The second is that obviously it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be meaningful. This is something I still grapple with. Our society wants us to be perfect. There's a lot of pressure to be perfect because we get scolded when we're not, or we get excluded when we're not. But if we strive for meaning, I find that that is the antidote to trying to be perfect. Stumbling leads to growth. I stumbled a lot. I continue to stumble. Every time I stumble now, I think, okay, growth, I know you're coming, because that's what it means to stumble. We're supposed to stumble. So in my book, I talk a lot about stumbling, but also after I published the book, I'm still collecting data, but the data is showing that there are 8 stumbling blocks that leaders typically face on their path to being more inclusive. And you can learn what your possible stumbling blocks are. So if you grab one of those bookmarks on your way out tonight, you can take the assessment, it's free, so that you can learn what your stumbling blocks are. What else? We're all leaders. This is what I tell all of my clients, you know this. Whether you like it or not, you're influencing the people around you. So you might as well get aware of that, because the way you sit, the way you talk, the way you smile, the way you say your name influences people around you. That's a lot of power that you have. So you can deny it all you want, or you can start accepting it and start loving that you have that power. And finally, home is where we belong. So I felt at home in the pool. I felt at home in the library. I feel at home in Austin. I feel at home with these two. And that's where I belong. And the great news is that we can create those conditions for home wherever we are. We don't have to wait for those conditions to meet us. And this is what home looks like for me. And there's some people missing here because I realize, Maxine, that when we're together, we never take pictures. But my dear friend Maxine should be up there. And my dear friend Anita and Pooja should be up there too. And many of you make me feel like home. And I want to thank you for being here tonight. And I think that's all I have to say. And Elizabeth has some questions.